A messenger walks toward a chamber for a formal meeting with the lord of the castle. But something old and deeply buried is about to be revealed, something that will depend far more on a gesture than on words. What is this messenger hiding, and what is about to unfold? France, 13th century. A land where alliances were sealed more by words than by swords, and castles stood not only as walls of defense, but as monuments of silence and pride. Ironwood Keep was in full motion. After years of quiet disputes over land and taxes, young Armand was preparing to seal a pact with a neighboring house, an alliance that promised more stability than affection. Nobles and emissaries were arriving from all corners of the region, bearing gifts, letters, and expectations. It was a ceremonial moment, but also a political one. And as always, behind the scenes, there were cracks for those who knew how to slip through. This is how Thierry returned, the man who passed through. The gates did not introduce himself as a former squire, nor as an exile. He arrived as a worn traveler, dressed modestly, carrying a letter in the name of a lesser-known regional lord, a name respectable enough not to raise suspicion, but peripheral enough not to draw much attention. The content was simple, a request for an audience to discuss trade agreements and shared levies. Signed, sealed, and seemingly legitimate, the castle's busy routine left little room for scrutiny. With so many guests to accommodate and Armand torn between speeches and ceremonial hunts, the stranger was directed to the common lodgings, allowed to await his audience over the coming days. No one there knew who he was, or pretended not to. The eyes that followed him were full of doubt, but empty of memory, and that was enough to let him move. But within, Thierry remembered everything: the stone floors, the smell of hay, the sound of steel clashing in the training yards. Nothing had changed, only he had. Banished years ago under a charge he never had the chance to contest, he bore the shadow of a crime he didn't commit. Treason, they said, and no one questioned it, not even Armand. Now he had returned. Disguised, yes, but not aimless. He knew that every step inside that castle was a gamble he could not afford to lose. Between authority and threat lies a narrow space, and Sir Gervais lived precisely within it. Commander of Armand's personal guard, Gervais was not one to be deceived by appearances. He knew that real dangers didn't arrive with trumpets. They crept in slowly, like diluted poison. That was why the newly arrived man unsettled him. Not because of his clothes, but because of the way he moved. The silence, the eyes that scanned. Too much and spoke too little. He didn't confront Thierry directly. He didn't have to. It was enough to be in the right place at the right time. An extra patrol in a hallway Thierry had passed, a quiet warning that a certain wing was temporarily closed, subtle delays in delivering messages about the requested audience. Nothing rude, but everything a little too precise. Thierry noticed immediately. Gervais wasn't just upholding protocol, he was closing in slowly, not with brute force, but with carefully measured pressure. The kind of control that doesn't expel, but contains. A message, unspoken yet clear. You may stay, but do not disturb the order. And still, Thierry didn't back down. What disturbed him more than the vigilance was Gervais's gaze. It wasn't the look of a man performing duty. It was personal. There was something deeper behind that stare, not just suspicion, but a familiarity too uncomfortable to name. A memory, perhaps? A buried fear? Thierry didn't have all the answers. Not yet. But he was beginning to realize that his presence in Ironwood was not only unsettling because of who he might be, but because of what others knew and didn't want to face. The great hall of Ironwood was covered in candles, banners, and pretenses. It was a night of celebration, but the walls didn't know how to smile. Thierry, standing at the margins, moved like someone still searching for the right place to step. As if the ground beneath his feet was made of scattered memories, seated at the far end of one of the smaller tables, he shared space with other low-ranking guests. The true nobles gathered at the center of the room, flaunting rehearsed laughter and raised goblets. That was where names carried weight, where words shaped alliances, and where he, even under a false identity, could feel the weight of erasure. He wore the same modest tunic from his arrival. Nothing about him stood out, and still he drew glances. There was something in the way he remained silent, in how his gaze moved with the quiet knowledge of someone who already knew this place. And that made people uneasy, because Thierry wasn't trying to blend in. He simply existed. In that environment, everything was delicately calculated, even mockery. When a young squire accidentally stumbled near him and spilled wine over his clothes, it had the air of an accident, but the smirk on the boy's face revealed intent. The red liquid dripped slowly down Thierry's fabric, and the chuckles that followed sliced sharper than the wine itself. Thierry didn't react. He simply stood, straightened his tunic, looked the boy in the eyes, and then scanned the room. There was no rage in his face, only a dangerous kind of patience, the kind that says, "I've been here before, and you have no idea what you've forgotten." He wasn't looking for pity or reparation. He knew exactly what he represented. A ghost left out of the portrait, someone many wished had never returned, but that's exactly why he remained firm. He wasn't trying to belong again. He was reminding them that he once did. And when silence returned to that room, curling itself back around sharp words and polished smiles, Thierry sat back down and stayed, because leaving would have meant surrender, and he hadn't come all this way to be erased again. What is expected of a messenger waiting for an audience? To keep his composure, ask no unnecessary questions, and find ways to occupy his time without disturbing those who truly matter. Thierry understood this perfectly and used it to his advantage. The letter he carried, signed in the name of a little-known regional lord, granted him a certain level of respect. Superficial, yes, but functional. He wasn't welcome, but he couldn't be outright dismissed either. In the days that followed, excuses for delaying his audience with Armand stacked up: an unexpected engagement, a sudden hunt, a conveniently timed headache. Thierry accepted each one with a calm nod. Outwardly, patience. Inwardly, calculation. While he waited, he slipped into the cracks of the castle's routine like water between stones. He helped in the stables without drawing attention. He spoke to servants without urgency. He watched the young squires train, eyes full of memories he hadn't asked to revisit. One of them even used a maneuver Thierry himself had once taught. Though the boy had no idea of its origin, no matter how well Thierry blended into the castle's routine, he couldn't ignore the emptiness surrounding his name. It was as if time had rolled over everything he had done and left no trace behind. Stories whispered through the halls, told of battles won, ambushes avoided, and heroic deeds credited to Armand and his most trusted men. But in none of those tales did Thierry's name ever appear. As if he had vanished long before he was ever sent away. It was strange to witness it from the outside. He had stood by Armand for years. He had served Lord Etienne with a loyalty few could comprehend. When delicate missions required silence, Thierry was the one sent. When Armand faltered on the battlefield, his sword had kept the air alive. And when Lord Etienne needed someone to guard his deepest confidence, he had chosen Thierry, handing him a ring reserved for those deemed irreplaceable. It wasn't that Armand had forgotten everything. It was that he had learned not to remember. And that realization cut deeper than any open insult, because open betrayal can be confronted, but deliberate forgetting, that leaves a bitter taste of injustice. Even so, Thierry wasn't seeking gratitude. His return wasn't a demand, it was a call. And if any trace of the young man he once called brother still lingered inside Armand, perhaps it could still be rekindled, but not through words, through memory. And the time had come to remind him. In a way that could no longer be ignored, the moment came without warning. Thierry was summoned for the long-awaited audience. After days of moving like a shadow through the corridors, he would finally be seen in the light. The room was not the grand hall, but a smaller chamber with high windows and austere furniture. Thierry entered without hesitation. On the other side, Armand waited, flanked by a few advisors, and of course Sir Gervais, still as a sentinel. But Thierry didn't look at him. His eyes went straight to the face of the man he had once called brother. Armand, seated, regarded him as if observing a stranger, no sign of recognition, no flicker of memory. The heir to Ironwood now carried the weight of command, but also the chill of someone who had learned not to trust ghosts. "State your name," he said flatly, as if guarding himself against deception. Thierry responded with the alias he had used since his arrival. Armand listened, expressionless, but something in his face shifted, barely perceptible, when Thierry's voice reached the corners of memory. "Many come here claiming to be useful," he continued, his tone lined with disdain. "Some think old stories and forgotten faces are enough to earn attention, but here we value loyalty, and loyalty doesn't get a second chance." Thierry didn't flinch, but inside, each word struck deep, not for their sharpness, but for their injustice. No one knew better than he did what loyalty truly meant, and to hear that from Armand was to be condemned again, without trial, without hearing, without truth. The conversation was short, mechanical, cold. Armand remained distant, even as Thierry tried to guide his words through paths lined with memories. It was clear now. Armand hadn't just forgotten. He had trained himself not to remember. Surrounded by people who had everything to gain from Thierry's absence, he had chosen comfort over truth. Thierry didn't raise his voice. He didn't plead, but when he left that room, something inside him broke again, and maybe it was precisely that fracture that gave him the strength to take the next step. Because if Armand had buried the truth, Thierry still held the one thing that could unearth it, a fragment of the past untouched by time. The castle slept, but that night Thierry wasn't searching for rest. The encounter with Armand had left behind a heavy silence, different from the others. It wasn't resignation, it was urgency. The patience that had guided him until now was no longer enough. He couldn't rely on time anymore. He needed to use what time had left behind. In the inner pocket of his tunic, still untouched after all these years, was the one thing that should never have left Ironwood. A ring of darkened silver, engraved with the house's crest and small carvings on the inside. A symbol of trust, not the ordinary kind. This ring had been given to him by old Lord Etienne in secret on the eve of his final expedition. It was a silent vow, reserved for the irreplaceable. Thierry never wore it. He carried it like someone holding on to a story that had no ending. The next morning, when he heard Armand would be inspecting the training fields, he saw the chance he needed. He waited for the right moment. Then, without introduction, he approached. Gervais moved to intercept him, as always. But Armand, perhaps out of boredom, perhaps curiosity, raised his hand and let him come. Thierry didn't speak. He simply opened his hand and revealed the ring. Armand froze. For a second, nothing was said. The heir's eyes locked onto the small silver circle, like someone who has stumbled across a scar they forgot they had. Time seemed to lose weight. "Where did you get this?" he asked, low but firm, the kind of voice shaken beneath its surface. Thierry still didn't reveal his name. Not yet. He simply replied, "It's been with me the entire time." Armand took the ring, hesitating. He turned it, read the engravings, ran his thumb over the crest like he needed to confirm it was real. And in that moment, something in his expression cracked. just slightly, as if part of the wall he had built began to give way. It wasn't a reunion, not yet, but it was the start of a fracture in the certainty with which Armand had rejected him. And where there's a crack, light finds a way in. The reunion that mattered didn't happen to fanfare, nor before a crowd. It took place in the shadow of the West Tower, inside a forgotten chamber where Armand usually met with his closest advisors. But that day he asked for only one person, Thierry. The room was empty, except for the two of them. No guards, no servants, just stone walls and the muffled sounds of mourning beyond them. Armand remained standing, the ring still in his hand, turning it between his fingers. His eyes no longer held arrogance, but neither did they hold warmth. What filled them now was conflict. Thierry, he said at last. And for the first time, he spoke the real name. Thierry lifted his gaze. He didn't reply. He didn't need to. The name alone had been enough. I spent years believing what I was told, what everyone said, Armand began, pacing slowly, as if measuring each step through old regrets. They said you fled, that you betrayed us, that you carried secrets from my father to the wrong hands. I believed it, because it was easier, because they told me trusting you was weakness. Thierry's silence wasn't indifference. It was restraint. Every word from Armand was a blade drawn from old wounds, and still there was relief in hearing them. But this ring, Armand continued, holding the piece as though it weighed more than metal. It brings back things. No one else remembers. I was just a boy. But I remember the day my father said, if ever you don't know whom to trust, look for the one brave enough to stay silent. And you said nothing. Thierry's eyes glistened, but he held himself still. It wasn't yet the time to unravel. I didn't know if I wanted you to be dead or alive, Armand confessed. Because if you were dead, I wouldn't have to carry the guilt. And if you were alive, then I'd have to face what I'd done. He stopped in front of Thierry, close enough that even a whisper would sound like a confession. Tell me, why? Why didn't you come back sooner? Thierry took a slow breath, and then, firm but quiet, because returning without truth meant nothing. I needed to know who gained from my absence before reminding you why you once trusted me. The silence that followed wasn't tense. It was needed, like the stillness between two acts. And there, in that quiet room with no witnesses, two men, divided by time and lies, began rebuilding the bridge the world had tried to burn. When the truth finally surfaced, it didn't come like thunder. It came like a slow, precise blade. With the ring in hand and memory stirred, Armand began to seek what had been forgotten. He revisited old records, listened to the whispers of aging servants, reread letters from his father, and paid attention to what had once been too inconvenient to notice. And then he saw it, the name of the true traitor, someone close, someone still walking those halls. Someone who had rewritten the story piece by piece, erasing Thierry from the history of loyalty to protect their own place at the table, Sir Gervais. He wasn't the mastermind behind the betrayal, but he had known from the beginning. And he stayed, silent, not out of pure malice, but out of calculation, for self-preservation, and in many ways, out of fear. When Armand confronted him, Gervais didn't deny it. He tried to justify it instead, said he acted to preserve order, to avoid chaos during a fragile time, claimed that Thierry, even if loyal, was dangerous because he knew too much. But by then, no explanation mattered. Armand didn't make a spectacle. Gervais was removed quietly from his post, charged with obstruction and falsifying records. The court whispered, but no one openly objected. Most had known deep down that something had always been wrong, and Thierry, he asked for nothing. No title, no favor, no public apology. When Armand offered to make amends, he simply shook his head. I only needed you to know what really happened, he said. The rest, time will take care of. He stayed a few more days in the castle, not as a guest, but as someone walking again over old ground, mending what time and silence had torn apart. He shared quiet moments with Armand by the training fields, watched the young squires practicing, unaware that the man in plain clothes was the reason they stood where they did. Then he left. No farewell, no ceremony, but he left the ring with Armand. And in that gesture, more than 1,000 words, was a message. Trust can be lost, but dignity, when preserved, has the power to turn even silence into legacy. Now tell me, if you were in Thierry's place, would you have come back? Or would you have let time carry away the last traces of what was unjust? Share your thoughts in the comments, and thank you for watching. See you next time.